Top focus at this hour. Global financial markets surged and crude oil prices tumbled over 6% following Donald Trump's sudden decision to call off major military strikes against Iran. Now, the abrupt pivot shaved Brent crude below $84 a barrel, and it triggered intense debate on Wall Street over the primary catalyst behind the White House restraint. One dominant narrative points directly to intense lobbying from West Asian capitals. Now, key regional heavyweights. Let's start off with Saudi Arabia. The Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman reportedly pressed Washington for a peaceful resolution as ongoing clashes threatened vital maritime trade routes. Regional leaders stressed that a full-scale conflagration would trigger catastrophic capital flight, halt mega projects, and destabilize critical energy infrastructure. Conversely, macro analysts argue that domestic economic imperatives ultimately forced the administration's hand. Surging fuel costs have driven U.S. retail gasoline averages above $4 a gallon, fueling headline inflation to 4.1%, and that is more than double the Federal Reserve's target. And it threatens Republican prospects ahead of the upcoming midterm elections scheduled later this year, within a few months now. Recent market trends around China, Japan, and India reducing exposure to U.S. treasuries reflects shifting global financial dynamics. While not a sudden dump, these nations are gradually diversifying reserves and even rising U.S. debt, currency pressures, and geopolitical considerations. Japan remains the largest holder but has intervened to support the yen, while China and India have been trimming holdings strategically, focusing on stability. Furthermore, the threat of sustained military engagement had previously sent 10-year U.S. Treasury yields testing 18-month highs near 4.71%. And the de-escalation announcement provided immediate relief, pulling the 10-year Treasury yield down roughly 5 basis points to 4.65%, easing pressure on federal debt servicing costs. Ultimately, the tactical pause that we're now seeing, one that we've seen in the past as well, has successfully cooled market volatility. That's again a trend we've seen in the past, offering temporary relief to global supply chains and risk assets alike. And looking at what drove the U.S. administration to take this decision, we are now being joined by Ross Darrell Feingold, political analyst, joining me from Taipei. Ross, thanks so much for making time. Always a pleasure speaking with you. Let's start right off. How much influence do you think Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states had in persuading the U.S. to step back from military action against Iran? Because we've seen Donald Trump do this in the past, hint at a major escalation and just before D-Day, call it off.
Clearly, President Trump has a very good relationship with the leaders of those countries. We know that from his visit. We know that from their visits to the White House, trade deals, agreements to purchase U.S. weapons. So I think it's fair to say that President Trump will give them lots of time. He will certainly speak to them on the phone and hear their views. Ultimately, though, of course, President Trump is going to do what he thinks is best for U.S. national security. So although the regional leaders certainly don't want a conflict, and frankly, I don't think President Trump wants the conflict to continue either. But if President Trump ultimately decides that he does have to use force, he will. So I don't think it's accurate to say that their views alone are the persuading factor here.
All right, let's take a domestic opinion here as well, or your opinion on the domestic impact of the war within the U.S. Could domestic economic pressures that everyday Americans are facing have impacted President Trump's decision? It's over $4 a gallon by now.
Yeah, President Trump is very sensitive to domestic political opinion. He might deny that, but of course we know that he is. We're 90 days away from the midterm U.S. election, the cost of living being a significant election issue and something that could hurt Republicans both in the House as well as the Senate and even potentially in state level elections as well. So certainly at this time where we're just 90 days out from the election, President Trump does not want people complaining about the price of filling up their cars. And he's definitely very sensitive to that. So I think that is a factor in why President Trump wanted the 60-day truce, the ceasefire, the MOU process. And I think he's very open to extending it. Now, one could say he's open to extending it out of political necessity, because he genuinely does want a solution that does achieve U.S. national security goals, but also does welcome Iran back into the community of nations, at least from a trading perspective, given that, look, President Trump has already made it clear he is willing to concede that if there is a deal on the nuclear issue, there's a deal on shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, then Iran could resume shipping oil to global markets.
But just look at the narrative, Ross. Iran still maintains that there is no discussion going on with the US, whereas Donald Trump has already tweeted it out, pulling back that strategic restraint, saying that within the ambit of the deal, the Strait of Hormuz is going to be dealt with now. Iran has never once mentioned that the Strait of Hormuz will change the status. The status quo will change ever since the war has started. They've always maintained it will never go back to the way it was. And at this point, if regional allies had any sway over Washington's decision, Iran still maintaining that no talks are going on, does this signal a shift in U.S. foreign policy?
No, because I think the U.S. position is very clear, which is that the Strait of Hormuz needs to be open for the safe transit of civilian shipping. And the U.S. is not going to tolerate Iran disrupting that. And frankly, I think the regional leaders agree with the U.S. position, even if they might not be able to say so explicitly for a variety of reasons. And no one around the world that purchases energy or other byproducts from the region. Nobody is supporting Iran's position. China isn't, or other potential customers of Iran in the past, like South Korea, Japan, which were purchasers of Iranian oil. Nobody is supporting Iran's position that Iran could somehow impose a fee or demand that ships transit through a certain channel close to Iran shores. So Iran is isolated on this, even though countries are understandably reluctant to say they want the U.S. to use military force. But Iran is very alone on this. And I think President Trump, to his credit, is still saying that I want to talk to you. I'm willing to make a deal. But if you insist on threatening civilian shipping, we will use force.
Ross, let me just quickly counter you on that. In terms of Iran's isolation, you saw states or fairly high-level delegations coming in from over 70 countries when the Ayatollahs, that entire ceremony took place last month. And at this same point, that included Saudi Arabia and Qatar, by the way. Now, Saudi Arabia is also holding sway over the U.S., maybe not alone, maybe not in isolation, but they did have, reports are suggesting, have some role to play in the U.S. calling it off towards the end. So Iran at this point, also we've all seen, the entire world has seen how the West, largely most NATO countries, did not want to have any part of this war. They wanted their oil out of Iran. And for that, they did need to maintain certain diplomatic relations with Iran. So how isolated do you feel Iran is, keeping all of this in mind?
No, it's understandable that delegations attended the funeral. Some of those countries do have long-time relations with Iran and personal relationship with the former leader. Islamic countries sending representation is certainly understandable as well. But that should not be read as an endorsement of Iran's position. If Iran is insisting on disrupting and threatening civilian shipping or exacting a toll, if Iran is insisting on continuing its nuclear research and development, then Iran is going to be very isolated. And again, I think that is the consensus position in the region, as well as more broadly around the world. And Saudi Arabia, we should also keep in mind, there's always a lot of discussion about Saudi Arabia looking for other partners, potentially China. But ultimately, Saudi Arabia has shown time and time again that it does consider the United States to be its premier security partner, and more recently, its premier technology partner. That's not going to change.
Fair enough. I take that point. But as far as Iran is concerned, they still hold sway over the Strait of Hormuz, owing simply due to the geographic location that they hold, which is so close to the strait, and that strait will always remain a vital point. And they also have certain amount of sway over the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, which is yet to be a card that they've not used till now. We'll need to wait and watch how this one goes out. There are still cards that both sides have not really used fully. Hope that never comes to the play at this point. Ross, Daryl Feingold joining me from Taipei. Always a pleasure speaking with you, Ross.
Thank you.